All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. I certainly, Todd and I appreciate you joining this morning, taking some of your time. I know there's a lot of choices out there to spend your time teleworking these days. So we thought we'd do just a kind of an information sharing today with some of the information we actually gathered last winter. And Todd did a lot of the heavy lifting on this. We did a customer survey to some of the customer groups we have, and also put this slideshow together. So I'm just going to be the presenter today, and we worked on this, in this new era of IDSS, and it just kind of shows the partnership that you kind of come together with the SU and the WCM to kind of think through these types of research and data collection, I guess, cases or projects that you may work on. Just kind of one window into, I guess, what we are doing these days. So yeah, again, we did this last winter. Let me get my slides rolling here. We did it during the January, February timeframe. It was before the probabilistic test beds were launched, and we had started to more aggressively move toward probabilistic messaging and started to pivot last winter, or before winter. We went through kind of a ramp up. So we wanted to take the heartbeat of what our different customer groups were thinking of these products, or what they thought of the products, and we provided examples that will show you the responses. We provided graphical questions and try to get some feedback on textual type questions too, on using probabilities and how they would use probabilities. So there were emergency management, school districts, and street and highway departments. A pretty good amount of responses, especially from the school districts. And we had a lot of feedback that was just open feedback that they provided, which was nice as well. And I'll show you a taste of that later in this presentation. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions here that we asked and look, just kind of see what their feedback was. First, we just graphically compared two informational plots that we're putting out for expected snowfall. One's got ranges on it, one's got a specific amount. And the customers in all three groups overwhelmingly said that they preferred the range rather than one single deterministic amount. That's probably intuitive to you, but this just kind of confirms it. And all three customer data groups were pretty much similar in that idea that the range is the way to go. We also asked and tried to kind of tease out some of these ideas about probability, and obviously there's maybe some unknowns with this kind of a question. If your customers really understand what you're trying to ask of them. So we asked this question. This graphic shows forecast snowfall ranges where we expect 50% or 1/2 of the observed snowfall reports to fall within. About 50% of the observed snowfall amounts will be outside this range, right? When we look at the centered 50th percentile, in a perfectly calibrated probabilistic system, which our probabilistic snowfall that we are using is fairly well calibrated, as we've seen from some of the verification of it. So we would expect, if we use that center 50%, that in a given season over the long haul, that 50% of the observed snowfall amounts will fall outside the range that you would post if you would post a graphic using that centered 50%. So we said, please rate the usefulness of this approach using that middle 50%. So provided that they understood the question, which took various iterations to kind of word correctly, and it's still not probably worded perfectly. We didn't involve social scientists on this to get our words perfect, so it's not a super elegant survey, if you will. But most of them were in the above average, right? They said, look, we're, I guess, willing to say that some of these reports that we find for a given storm or given storms over a season will fall outside your range. They were okay with that. They all ranked it level 3 or higher as useful. So that was an interesting finding, even though we specifically stated that we're kind of have a hit rate of 50% there. So then we asked the question, if we were to increase the range to hit or catch 80% of the snowfall reports instead of 50%, right, higher verification, snowfall ranges might increase from 3 to 5 to say 1 to 6 inches. But more reports would then fall into that range. How useful would you find that approach? And so I've just compared the 50%, we've compared the 50% on the bottom that we just saw on the last slide to the 80% catch. And you can see that they didn't really like, I think what I imply from this is that they didn't really like the drop, the increased range. Even though the hit rate was higher, that larger range probably made it harder to use for the EMs. And then when we look at all three groups, we see fairly similar findings with the schools and the EMs. Schools probably finding it harder to plan based on that larger range. And then the highway department, this is the first sign in this data set that in presenting to you that these highway users are a more technical group. These are the highway and street department responses that we got, and that user customer group is different from the EMs and schools. These EMs and schools are more alike. And the highway at the bottom, you can see that they find actually more use in it. So they start to separate a little bit there, and you'll see that throughout this talk. So again, another graphic with just looking at colors versus the sample points. This basically asks, do you prefer the color shade on the left or the shades and labels on the right? And every time we asked this question, it was shading with labels overwhelmingly. So if you have a choice operationally to make a graphic with sample point information on it, overwhelmingly in this study that customers like that better. I think otherwise, at least for me, I'm on the left-hand side. I'm looking back and forth at the color and then the legend and the color and the map and the legend. I'm trying to figure out which blue that is because my eyes are a little bit colorblind. So, you're kind of going back and forth. So then we started to take the lead of some of the Dakota's offices last year and started to mess around a little bit with an experiment with this impact risk level, kind of an impact for hazardous travel. Rather than giving snow amounts, what's the probability of hazardous travel? So in this case, maybe using what's the probability of 4 inches or more? But we title it maybe a little bit different. What's the probability for hazardous travel? And so this one was just another one of those compare the sample points to the non-sample points. And again, we saw the shading with the labels is preferred. But then we asked a little bit more on this. These graphics would focus more on risk of impact and less on exact snow amounts. And we were kind of trying to tease out if this would be useful information to these different groups. Rather than giving a snowfall amount exactly, maybe at these larger, in these more uncertain systems that come through or at longer lead times, possibly. Could we go this route? Would this be information that you could use? And I think the overwhelming EM, emergency management and school feedback was yes, it would be quite useful, and instead of snow amounts maybe. And then the highway department, being that technical group, wanting to know the details right on how much snow I'm going to have to clear off the roads, they were thinking, not so much. So again, we're seeing the difference between those customer groups. And then, do you think creating an impact risk level from predicted snowfall amounts is a fair approach? So we asked this in an open-ended question and just let their feedback kind of roll in. And we got a ton of responses. Almost everybody in the emergency management and school district groups, in fact, almost everybody in the study had something to say, had some thoughts to share. And so I've really boiled this down. Here are some of the emergency management responses. As long as I'll go through some of these. I know it's text heavy, but there's no real other way to do this. But yeah, as long as the chances for the risks are understood, which is true, right? Yes, people tend to minimize risk in their mind and rationalize why it's okay to travel. I think what we overwhelmingly found in here was that these customer groups thought it was easier for people to understand the impact, or that the hazard, the snowfall would actually affect their life or have an impact a little bit more. So it made that connection a little bit more. It would help the public understand the potential severity of the incoming storm. Not only that snow is falling, but how they're being impacted by the snow. Citizens always want to know how weather will affect them for decisions being made. You know, it's interesting because my wife, who's lived here in Wisconsin for most of her life, maybe like 3 years ago, we were going to take a trip, and I said, you know, it looks like it's going to snow 2 or 3 inches. And she said, so what will that mean for how the roads will be? You know, and she lives with me, right, a meteorologist, and we've lived in Wisconsin our whole life, but she wants to know how it's going to impact her. So it made me start thinking, you know, maybe when we have graphics that just tell about the snow amounts, maybe we're missing that. Maybe we're missing the link to what the impact is going to be. So maybe we should be leading our graphical titles with impacts, you know, hazardous travel expected, rather than snowfall today, or, you know, snow totals. So something to think about. Some other thing, I think, some other comments in here, I think it will get the public to think about the risks and plan accordingly. You know, again, it's a connection of taking that next step between snow amounts and impact. And then there's some of these that, you know, there's higher level users in here. Moisture level of the snow should be factored in as well, light versus heavy, blowable or not blowable. So, you know, there's more in this this impact than just the snow total, and some of those people in the emergency management group picked up on that. So here's some of the school district responses. Yes, because it helps our school district determine if we send out our long range trips, might make individuals pay closer attention to the weather and their plan. Not useful. I use my own experiences when determining risk, and I think that's, you know, that's what we do as humanoids. We try to assess our risk, right? Yes, it gives another perspective of the danger of the travel involved. So again, more of these connective links, I think we're getting here. And then just another page of them. Yes, as we deal with slightly warmer winters and smaller budgets, the real issue is travel risk, not precipitation totals and types. You know, there's sometimes you get some wild answers, and of course the obligatory. We wish you would be close to correct. Nothing you predicted this year for our area has been correct. You got to always have that obligatory one thrown in there. And then there's no, not really, the more simple the better. But a majority of the responses were positive, as we saw in those bar graphs. When we go to that third group, that highway street department group, you start to see the technical nature, and you start to see that what they're looking for is more detail about the snow, and then other elements. You know, they're a fairly savvy group, right? Their wind, temperature, you see in their feedback a lot of details of the different parameters or variables that they're thinking about when they go out and do their work. So it's not only snow or ice, but also wind, temperature, plow route, roadway classification, and or owner. So different things, but a lot of these, you know, not, somewhat, yes, no. I think it presents some challenges, not really, no. So more negativity you saw with these, as you saw in the bar graphs. But again, in the red, you see all these different elements that they're thinking about as a more technical user. And so here's just another page of those. Again, I like the concept. It's a unique way to essentially share snowfall amounts, but frame it in a more human-directed way. It answers, so what does 5 inches of snow mean for me? Again, some of that, how is it going to impact me, rather than just what the amount is. I don't see this being of any use. As soon as the first flake hits the road impact risk will increase, right? So that's a highway department person, right? Clearly they think any snow on the road is it produces a risk. So it's not 4 inches necessarily, it's not 3 inches. It's once you have a covering of snow on the ground, they see the perceived risk go up, which is true. So then we started another set of questions here, which is, how do our snowfall amounts match wording, right? So if you go forecaster to forecaster in the office, what's their definition of slippery or hazardous or dangerous? And do we mix those numbers internally? And so what we try to do is try to see what our customer base thought about some of the different adjectives or descriptive words that we use in our products and our service. And so here's, again, EM, schools and highway. And what do you associate with slippery conditions? And overwhelmingly, the EMs and the schools were in that 1 to 3 range for slippery conditions. And then the highways go lower, predominantly less than an inch. So, you know, they believe that it gets bad as soon as you got that first dusting of snow on there, which is fairly true. But for the most part, it's about 1 to 3 inches you can expect slippery roads. So the next step in that is, what snow amount would you associate with hazardous conditions? And so that would maybe fall into an advisory type of level here. 3 to 6 inches is what the overwhelming majority felt for all 3 groups here. So pretty good agreement here as hazardous travel conditions in that 3 to 6 inch snowfall range. And then finally, dangerous. And you see a fairly good correspondence in that +6 inch range, or +6 inch snow amount grouping and above 10 inches. So most of the pie is made up of this purple and green area for really all 3 of them. So you start to get dangerous probably at about 6 inches. Highway department thinks maybe a little bit more, but then there's 3 of the 26 respondents said less than 1 inch is dangerous, right? Their experience on the roads leads them to say, look, any snowfall becomes dangerous. And when we use it, we're thinking, more of a life-threatening. So it just, like I mentioned early on in this subset here, is that we're trying to get a little bit more consistent in our internal wording. So we kind of came up with this table and went back and looked at the historical 2-day snow amounts at La Crosse for our area, and just kind of ranked it, put it into a percentile. On the right-hand side, you see where it was in the historical percentile. And then, it really came in nicely with both the percentiles and what our customers were looking at for these different descriptive words. And it was kind of amazing to me that these 2-day snowfall totals, we didn't have a whole lot of events that were over, say, 13 inches of snow. So when you start to get up to above 10 inches of snow from a snowstorm, it's a fairly rare event, even in Wisconsin. You start to be in that 98 to 99 percentile. So now what we're trying to do is keep our wording internally consistent for the snow amounts. Scientifically, they look like, the percentiles, these fit well into the percentiles, and keep our wording internally consistent in our graphical messaging and textual messaging as well in our products, basically, and service. Then we went down to the 10th and 90th percentile, just to find out how useful these were to our customers, if they were using them. We started to last winter, we started to beat the drum a little bit harder for these, and for the most part, they were being used frequently, occasionally to frequently, for most of the users here. And we'd probably like to see a little bit more of that with the 10th and 90th. We basically then broke it down and said, what do you think about the high end amount? How much usefulness is there in that? And for the most part, they thought that was a fairly usable product. They liked the worst case scenario situation for their use in snow planning. And what about the low end amount? You see that the bar graphs start to slide towards not as useful. You can see all of the groups still found it useful, but you see a little bit more from the last slide to the low end. It's just not quite as useful as the higher end amount, but still the majority of these responses are at least 3s, 4s, or 5s. So some takeaways from just some of this research that we conducted is that if you have a choice between ranges and a single amount, use ranges and turn on your sample points for your graphics. That's what our customers would say they prefer. Customers seem to tolerate the error rate on the centered 50% probability snowfall ranges. They even though that they knew they were only going to hit a verification of 50% within that range, that they like the smaller range. Of course, I think the idea here, though, is that we as service providers, we try to, if we're going to use the probabilities, we try to get to the 80% level, because 80% of the, that means that 80% of those snowfall reports will verify within that range, in that centered 80%. So I think it should be our goal to get to that, the 10th, 90th anytime we can. If you have a choice between the 25th and 75th percentile and the 10th and 90th, you should always try to get to the 10th and 90th, because you're going to verify and have a higher hit rate. And the trade-off is the larger ranges. So you have to kind of weigh that when you're looking and trying to choose what you're going to message. And that's what we've been doing in the probabilistic test bed. Is the goal is to get to that centered 80% because you hit rate more. But at what cost do the ranges get too large to really have an effect or be useful by our customers? And then translating snow probabilities to travel impact graphics seem to add value. They seem like, and some of the feedback was that it makes the connection to what between snowfall amounts and impact, and that impact may have a more impact, if you will, on how users and the public respond. Except for the technical user, which is the highway and street departments. They want the details. Good agreement across the schools, emergency manners and highways and streets on slippery, hazardous, and dangerous words. They were all in fairly good agreement on snowfall ranges that correspond to those three words. And then our 10th and 90th snowfall amount graphics are being used. We'd probably like to have them used a little bit more. And then the high end was slightly more useful than the 10 percentile. But the low end was a little bit more useful to the DOTs than the other two groups. And again, this highways and street departments are a special, more technical group, and we need to treat them as such. And I think a lot of us know that, but this just kind of bears it out. So that's my presentation, and Todd is here as well on the line if you have questions and regarding the presentation. Again, thanks for your time and thanks for joining in today.